the series of readings that we have places us in the fullness of the Lord. The Son of God is the new and complete Moses, sitting and teaching with authority on another holy mount. You have heard that it was said, but I say to you. And here, in the one that we have today, we have a typical paradox. The Lord starts with the actual wording, eye for eye and tooth for tooth, and does not give an explanation to the effect that what this was saying was only a tooth for a tooth, only an eye for an eye. It's called the law of the talion. It was already a limiting of damage. One doesn't kill, one goes only that far. But he then brings in this heroic going further. And indeed, literally, this going the second mile comes in here. Normally, our attitude to things coming at us should therefore not just be human and normal. They should be evangelical. And it is often the acid test. Is this somebody in authentic relationship before me when this comes at him? Or is he more of the same thing? To be very concrete, if one is driving the car and one goes into road rage, one is not being evangelical, one is being more of the same thing. If one, when approached by a person in need, is unpleasant, one is not being evangelical, one is being more of the same thing. But closer to home, if we are easily ignited, behaving in a way very different from this behaviour and tone given us in the Sermon on the Mount, again there we are more of the same thing. And in practice we are, without realizing, betraying the fact that at that moment at least we are not in relationship. If we are in relationship with him, we're never switched off and never reproducing his spirit. If we are, then there are bits that are not his and in which the current is not passing. In the first reading, we have this powerful verse. Now is the acceptable time. This is the day of salvation. Just this evening, Ellen passed me some very interesting material about souls who perhaps hadn't realized that when they had time and they're in trouble. But somehow they have not been lost, those in this little book. However, what comes through very strongly is this: they had not realized the importance of the present moment when it was there. And when they're in purgatory, the time scale is quite different. One story actually is very indicative of that. It's the case of two good priests, I believe they're actually monks, who had a devotion to the holy souls while on earth and celebrated many, many times for them. And before the end of their life, because they were good soul friends, they made a pact that whoever was left behind after the death of the other would the following morning offer his mass for his soul. That happened. One died. And True to his promise, the other one, the following dawn, celebrated for the repose of his friend's soul. He was in thanksgiving after, and what appeared before him was the soul of his friend. He was in light. He was actually in bright light and glory. He was on the winning side, and he got there. And the first shock was blissfully consoling for the other one. But then he changed tone and somewhat appearance, and started to reprimand him for not having kept his promise. He complained he had forgotten completely about his promise, for he had spent, was it 100 or 1,000 years?
I can't remember.
Or was it a whole year? It was a whole year.
1 year.
It was a whole year in purgatory. And the other one immediately protested, "But I've just finished saying Mass for you now." And then it was that they both realized what had happened. The time scale was not what we know. And the Lord applied in a compressed night all that was due. Because priests have a very severe judgment, you know why. And so it was that, as far as he knew, it was a whole year, but yet it was only that one night. This day I was reading the life of a holy monk who became a very holy hermit, Charbel Maclouf, canonized by Paul VI at the end of the Second Vatican Council. He was of the Eastern Rite, a Maronite, and he had permission to become a hermit in the hermitage belonging to the monastery, but on the mountain there in Lebanon. A very austere man who did many miracles during and after, and is still doing them. But one important event in his life which gave him a shot in the soul and really got him moving irreversibly was this event. He had this experience that he said to one priest only, the Père Berouti. But he said that he was not to tell anyone about it until after he had died. It was this: Aujourd'hui, un homme de Alma est décédé, son âme est en enfer. Today, a man from, and that was the local village, died, and his soul is in hell. It got him moving big time. So all the moments that was left on earth for him were given to austerity for the salvation of souls. Extreme austerity, not a moment lost. Eventually, because of his great purity and closeness to Jesus, he had this gift of being able to bless water, and it had come from all over the place, even Muslims, because the water that he blessed healed. And after his death, miraculous oil started to ooze from his body and his coffin, his tomb, and still goes around the world healing. But he, after his death, was so close to the throne of glory that it didn't stop there. They had no real picture of him. He was hidden in Christ, and it was fairly early in time. And a group of pilgrims came to honour the place where he had lived on the mountain and took a group photo. What was not their shock when on that photo, as well as the group, was the man. This is a miraculous photo of a person now in glory, but when he was already in glory. It is his appearing on the negative. They have made it bigger here so as to put it in this snap, but it's this very picture that was taken by these pilgrims. So that's how thin the barrier is between time and eternity, and these souls still care. At somebody's request, I'm offering this Holy Mass for the Holy Souls, and so they're plugged in. And we know from Padre Pio how at Masses of this kind they're pulling at the chasuble of the priest. I want to share, I want to share. And you can put your deceased here, especially if one uses the old Eucharistic prayer where there's a pause after the consecration for them. They can be named, and that naming apparently is powerful for them. Which brings me to where I want to land and finish. In the various countries of the Catholic world where there is a crisis of vocation, or should we say of answering vocation, because they're two separate issues, there have been here and there various modes of solving the problem. And it is interesting to note that in a big French discussion of this, the immediate reaction was to harness the sleeping giant, how to use the laity. And this author here, in a very pithy way, comments that that is actually to miss the very essence of the point. The priesthood is irreplaceable. Now, the devil knows that the priesthood is irreplaceable. He knows the infinite power of just one celebration, because it's Calvary on earth, until the end of time. And so, right now, he is making sure that by fair means or foul, as few as possible arrive at ordination, and as few as possible persevere until death after ordination. Already he has managed to take away the most effective way of obtaining priests, the combination of good catechesis and purity of life with closeness to the presence. I mean at the foot of the altar. Because, and this is what the Vatican knew when they were discussing the whole issue in the 90s, if one opens it to the lassies as well, the boys eventually will not want to serve. And it has been the case. The word for altar boy in Italian is chierichetto. It means a little cleric. And often that's where embryonically the priest was. I remember in school days, when concelebration had still not come in, generalised as it is now, we had, both in our parish and in the parish next to the school, 6 or 7 priests, and there were still individual celebrations, and therefore I was used often for the one by the same priest every morning on a weekday on Our Lady's altar on the left. And just morning after morning, being at the foot of the altar, literally there, a few inches from the presence, and even sharing the priest's host because he'd break it up, just by being there in a state of grace, one was completely open to whatever might happen. And there's no need for a huge vocations drive. Leave the child there, and the Lord will do the rest. I've seen it also handling innocent children in the Latin Mass. Expose them to much grace, let them huddle next to Jesus and to you, and quietly the Lord will do the rest. The devil knows it. Make sure they're never allowed to be with a priest. Does that sound familiar? then it doesn't stop. It actually becomes far more complex than one can think. People drift towards you if you're a hermit and spending your time listening. They come for discernment and advice. And if you're doing it all the time, there's bound to be a proportion who will be discerning, yes, vocation. It's a huge burden of responsibility that one bears at that time, because one word can send them to the right place or the wrong place. And the wrong place is easier to find than the right place. Indeed, the wrong place is still available, and the right place might not be. And so, what is going to happen? One can say the risk, yes, go, but one knows full well what is going to happen down the line. One can say, go to another place, and what will happen? They are lost for Ireland. That's the situation right now. It's a huge victory for you know who. This year, there were 14 who entered, compared with 57 in Britain, and one of those 14 was of the Eastern Rite. And by now, they've had time to be sifted out and for some to leave, I presume. But it doesn't stop there. This was given to me by a person who is studying at Maynooth. It's a recent article published on the 31st of May in the Catholic Voice. And it's just a calm, serene rendering of the facts as they are in the only seminary that we have. This is going to make your hair stand on end, so be prepared. We had, 4 years ago, the apostolic visitation, with certain things laid down. There have been cosmetic changes, but much of the theology being taught is still not in conformity with the magisterium, despite the demands of the visitation report. The pastoral program is certainly not priestly and sacramental. In fact, seminarians have been told that while on parish placement they are lay ecclesial ministers, not seminarians. There is little focus on cultivating true priestly identity. I'm skipping big bits. Of particular note this year is the fact that one class in particular will potentially be completely decimated. It is what happens at the end of the pastoral year. We have a situation in which 60%, because there were 10 on pastoral placement, and 6 have been told that they are not allowed to go to the next year in the seminary, but have to repeat at least once the pastoral year, and some may have to repeat it twice. Now, the reason is this. The pastor that looks after them for the year has to make a report at the end of it. Usually what comes back is, yes, a good candidate, gets on very well with people, and then a series of very good points, and then, because they have to be balanced, one point will be thrown in as an afterthought. Maybe he could loosen up about a few things. Oh! And so they'll look into that. And it just happens that all the 6 have one thing in common. They're the most faithful, the most prayerful, the most orthodox, the most reverent, and the most desirous to serve the church. Now, how does that come about? It's like this. Different from other seminarian situations, the president looks down to strata beneath him to get feedback and eventually, more or less, to decide whether he has the last word. And the slot of the priest responsible for the pastoral year is the one that is actually determining in practice. And the reason why that one has become so important and so determining is that in practice the word is not that of the priest himself, but of, it would seem, the sister, the nun who is working with him and is of very clear ideas about what a priest should be and not be, and is a self-declared feminist. Now, although she might not say that in public, that would probably mean that she's in favour of priestly ordination for women, which is impossible, of course, by nature. But the more that one can make a crisis happen, the more that problem is going to come and therefore be used as a lever. So, these 6 are now under tremendous psychological pressure of having given all to the church and having done exactly what they were told to do at every stage and kept their mouths completely zipped and a low profile at every stage, never saying anything in class, going along with all the ways of doing of the seminary with regard to the way that the Holy Mass is celebrated, but I won't go into detail on that one, there's no point. And therefore being told that there's no certainty that they can go on even after another pastoral year. Psychologically, that situation is devastating, and there are some under such pressure that it's going to damage their mental health, probably. They are being watched, they are being obviously disfavoured. And I have heard also on the grapevine that a pattern that emerges is that often those who have great academic gifts are not the ones who are actually sent for further studies after ordination, but others of less excellent calibre, but of more modern ideas. Now, what I am saying is this. One can look at this just as human and social, but one doesn't realize that the demon is far more intelligent than any man, and far more aware also of what the Catholic Church is and what the priesthood is within it. So he is doing all he can to make sure that it doesn't happen, and if it does happen, it happens with as little fruit as possible. So that the concept of priest becomes that of more or less a managing director, not having direct contact with souls in saving ministry, but in sitting at a desk, telling lay people what to do in places where he should be. A huge victory for the enemy of the soul, who above all wants immortal souls in his kingdom, and knows full well that the best means to make that happen is to make sure that there's no priest to absolve.